Hello world of YouTube and welcome to the listening log update for June of 2024. I will be talking about all 12 albums that I put on the teaser image for the month. I know I've been kind of bad about putting stuff on the back burner that I'll hold on to for at least another month. One record in particular, it's been sitting back there for so long. But I wanted to get my back burner cleared up for the back half of the year, and June itself was dense with releases that I was excited for on top of that. So there's a lot that I cover in this video. Either way, I hope that you're excited for it. Give it a like if you are, and let's go ahead and get started with...
It's okay to just admit that you're jealous of me. You're obsessed and just confess it, cause it's all...
Every Charli XCX album that she's done over the last 5 years has ended up on my best of the year list, with growing higher placements with each release on top of that. I think that she's just riding this really good creative artistic wave that I think coalesces into a brilliant head on Brat. You know what? While I loved the much more synth-driven, not I want to say straightforward pop edge, that coded Crash, it is what I think made it an even bigger grower for me because it showcased her artistry in a pivot that she then further integrates into her world with Brat. You know, I think that it sort of marries a lot of the ideas that she had been pulling together sonically and even emotionally on records like How I'm Feeling with the vibrant highs throughout an era like Charli, while also keeping true to some of the sonic palette of a record like that as well. You know, I think that the club-fueled energy of this helps bring those tense, bratty emotions to a high on tracks like Sympathy is a Knife and the single Von Dutch especially. I love the attitude of that song, and I love the soundscape of it. And I just love where the sounds on this go in general. You know, I think that there's a lot of really good dance energy on here that I think is fantastic. And that's from a couple of different atmospheres, because you've got the club stuff, like club classics on top of that, with the more crash-inspired or more straightforward synth stuff, like the incredibly infectious 360 and Rewind, the former also being sort of brought all the way around on the N365 expertly, and, you know, helps give this record a sort of 360, 365 mantra experience. There's a headspace to the record where it feels like you get to see Charli's highs and lows throughout a variety of backdrops, you know, that lead to this cool sequencing moment, these cool sequencing moments as well. Like how Sympathy is a Knife takes that bratty energy and twists it into something even more introspective on I Might Say Something Stupid after that. You know, the same sort of thing kind of happens on Von Dutch and Everything is Romantic, but gets sort of twisted into a different direction, but I still think is expertly done. You know, that sort of storytelling through sequencing, I feel like even getting further drawn out as the record goes on. And I think Six the Landing just as potently. Rewind having this yearn for going back, leading into a track like So I, where she interpolates Sophie track and reflecting on how much Charli misses Sophie. And that sort of energy carrying into Charli looking at herself in the industry. Something that mood-wise I feel like gets carried into the cold, pensive Apple, where I feel like there's this mood that starts in one spot and just carries all the way through that I think is just so well put together. Just this record is fantastic. I think that the hooks are also super fucking catchy. You know, I think that, like, as far as creating an experience that, even with a bonus edition, doesn't feel like it even needs that same kind of padding that a record like Crash I thought did at the time. You know, I think that this record is just absolutely chef's kiss. You know, I think that as far as, like, recreating a series of very specific but ultimately potently human moments in Charli's life into this experience, I think is just done masterfully. And I know that over the last month, it's been getting a lot of hype to a large degree, but I very much agree with a lot of that hype. I do think that this is an Album of the Year contender. Its deluxe edition, even more of that. I think that this is just it is a 10 out of 10 experience. I think it's a very good pop record, and I think that as far as, like, building upon so many different aspects of Charli's career, a la kind of what she did on Charli, Brat pushes that even farther, in my opinion, into a direction that I think is just so well done. No notes. Fantastic release.
Call me riff rap, I've been on that. Call me, I've been that. Clear the floor out. Where's your...
While this is my first time covering Joey, Valence, and Brae on the channel, I am not unfamiliar with their brand of, like, throwback hip-hop, and I really like what they're doing, and I'm glad to see them get some really nice success and some adoration across the board in the scene. I think that they are really good at tapping into that, like, old school, very East Coast influence, but almost, like, enhanced to the nth degree style of, like, Golden Age hip-hop worship that they do. While I didn't talk about Punk Tactics, I do think that it is a pretty solid record, and I think, honestly, a really good introduction to their particular brand of old school worship, and I think that as far as, like, cranking up that meter even more so on No Hands, they do so tenfold. You know, the moments where they very much go farther and, like, enhance those inspirations in the way that I feel like Eminem tried to do on a track like Berserk, I think comes across a lot more successfully on this. You know, moments like the drum and bass breakdown on almost Run DMC-esque opener Bust It, I think is sick as fuck. I think Danny Brown is a great idea on paper, and Pack a Punch is a stellar fucking single. I love Danny. I think he fits their chemistry as a whole. And as far as, like, a good representation of, like, a pivot in mood and instrumental palette, I think it also follows a track like Bust It pretty smoothly. There's so many simple but effective hooks on this, like on The Baddest, or on, again, the aforementioned Pack a Punch. They're very much classic and inspiration, but I think bring that to a modern view pretty successfully. And that focus on dance, along with a focus on the old school worship, like juxtaposing, like, the piano chords on What You Need against the, like, brass sample on OK. It's all very early 90s, but in a way that I think is c'est magnifique. There's some fun, witty bars. There's some fun jovialness. There's just a lot of cool moments on top of that. Like the transition of Intermission 2 into Baddest, I think is dope as hell. I don't know. This project is neat. I think it's a really, really good, fun hip-hop record that I think if you love old school inspired hip-hop, it's a good place to go. I'm giving this an 8. It's a strong-ass album, and I think very much worth your time. I think Kaytranada's been on a pretty good hot streak with a lot of the stuff that I've checked out from him collaborative-wise over the last couple of years. You know, I've loved Simple, the IDK project. I really liked Kaytranada. I thought that was a really fun, laid-back summer record. And on top of that, I am very excited, given some of the collaborators that he had been teasing were in the pot for this album, Timeless. A record that sounds so immaculately put together. As far as, like, top tier from this year, this is giving a lot of stuff a run for its money. The gleam that this record has is just immaculate. And I think that that cleanness helps carry the mood that this relatively instrumental or cyclically hook-driven experience even farther with the listener, in my opinion. You know, the opener, Timeless, the way that the synths just kind of melt amidst the hard-hitting drums, create this very cinematic atmosphere that I think starts the album off incredibly strongly. You know, that same cleanness helping accent tracks, like the bass-driven weird, those harmonies just sound so good above that groovy-ass beat that I think from a sequencing perspective, you know, snaps brilliantly into the instrumental dance, 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 dance. That's one thing I also really love about this record, that the sequencing is incredibly tight. You know, every track just snaps into each other so seamlessly in a way that I think is just magnificent. Same thing I loved about the Charli XCX record. This has that same kind of just sharp, well-accented sequencing where every track just sort of blends together into this really smooth experience. You know, when looking at it on some streaming platforms, it separates the record in a certain way that looks a little jarring, but the record's put together in a way where that very much makes sense. You know, Witchy, the collaboration with Childish Gambino that I was really happy to see, I think, comes together beautifully. Again, just a lush, catchy jam. I think the two of them work together magnificently. That smoky atmosphere that crops up on tracks like Spit It Out also just sort of create this good vibe that, again, Kaytranada just keeps so fucking silky. Same can be said for that Anderson .Paak Seer collaboration, Due to Me. I love the groove of that track. Again, Anderson .Paak. I'm going to be talking about him next, but I mean, that's a collaboration that I think is just so fucking smooth, and I think sits in a really good pocket on the project. I also liked the way that the second part of this record starts with the Thundercat and Pink Panthers collaborations. I like both those tracks. I wish Thundercat one was a bit longer, but that's sort of a complaint I have for a handful of songs on here. But that Pink Panthers cut is choice as hell. I love the groove and the synths on that. You know, the way that the synths dance on video before the groove, you know, weaves between it is just a fantastic moment. I love the synth sounds on the Tinashe collaboration more than a little bit as well, and the synths on a track like Stepped On, I think bring a different side of funk that I think Kaytranada pulls together fantastically. You know, Still is another collaboration I kind of wish had a little more going on, or at least a track as a whole that I kind of wish had a little more going on. You know, there's a lot of this record that I think is choice, a lot of it that I think utilizes, you know, the energy, or at least carries the record into a good space. There's just a couple jams that I think left a little bit to be desired upon respins, but I'm still giving this an 8. I think the sound, again, immaculate. Probably one of the best produced records I'll hear all year.
Daydreaming when I met you, never met you.
If there were a record whose production could give that Kaytranada one a run for its money, though, this NxWorries album is some sublimely produced shit. Again, the way that these tracks just jump into each other is so fucking smooth. The way he cuts the shit out of the gate on 86 Centra, while also reintroducing himself on this backbeat, expertly so. Anderson .Paak has been in a hell of an era, and he sort of reminds you of that throughout pockets of that track, while using the rest of the track listing to just show off in a myriad of other ways while updating you to other different pockets of his life as it's been, while Knowledge just keeps the production sublime the entire time, and getting to, you know, have his own little breaks, you know, amidst the mix as well, like on Lookin'. But tracks like Keep Her, where he talks about a failing relationship that sort of fizzled out, sort of tangentially from the fame, is this sort of solemnness that I feel like sort of permeates throughout parts of this, but I think gets further fleshed out throughout those moments, you know, or just does the fun counting across a verse, you know, thing, like on Distractions, which sort of fits the mantra of that song. You know, Where I Go sort of flips some of those emotions from earlier in the record into a more positive place with a fantastic collaboration from her. A moment where the energy sort of gets carried throughout the next couple of tracks, like the just psychedelic guitar solo-filled Daydreaming, a moment that I think is so fucking awesome. I love that. As far as like a traditional, just R&B-ass R&B song, Daydreaming is a modern gem in that scope, in my opinion. There's a lot of moments on this where it feels like he's sort of carrying some of that inverse from Silk Sonic as well, and like Here I Am. You know, there's parts of Silk Sonic that feel intimate and lustful, and that same energy gets sort of flipped on Here I Am so fucking well. You know, the organs on Here I Am help give his confessional style songwriting just this edge that I absolutely adore. The Earl collaboration helps close the record out. Walk On By, I think, is another smash in my opinion. There's a lot of this record where there's a lot of really good highs where I think the atmosphere is choice, the hooks are potent, and all the collaborators in the pod are just cooking with gas. As a whole, I think this record is really fucking good. I think that if you like Anderson .Paak's energy and you want to hear it over just some well-constructed, again, impeccable instrumentals, this NxWorries record is a choice version of that. I'm going to be giving this an 8 out of 10. I think that it is fan-fucking-tastic, and I think that if you like records that have great sequencing and great production on top of everything I said, again, like the last record, you can't really go wrong here. I'm kind of all over the place with 21 Pilots as a group. You know, they have some records that are alright, they have some that I think are pretty solid, and some that I really don't like. Case in point, their last album, Scaled and Icy, I think is easily one of their weakest records in their catalog, but I would never count these guys necessarily holistically out, even if I think that By the By, they're fine. You know, I think that they do a good job at writing some catchy-ass tunes while having this deeper nuance to their writing that I may not appreciate full stop, but, you know, similarly to a band like Coheed and Cambria, can enjoy passively, even if their writing doesn't go quite as hard in the paint, to being true to itself, like the fucking Amory shit with Coheed. I think that, like, the stuff that they do lends to more like a fun callback in some cases, like the opener Overcompensate, which welcomes the user back to Trench, or even, again, how the record comes to a close with the reveal of this sort of discussion between an A and B on the closer Paladin Straight. And I think, especially with the case of Clancy, I think that this marries well with a record like Trench as far as being this diverse sort of smattering of ideas, but as opposed to some of the more broader world building on Trench, I like that Clancy does kind of rein it in to a POV of this world. I would almost akin the writing on this, again, sort of bridging to the worlds of Coheed, similarly to like Burning Star 4 in some of its instances. Very much tracks like I'm Coming, Jenna's Version, or some of the gravitas and mood that a record like that channels on tracks like Vignette, but again, keeping it a little more personally driven. One of the things I do appreciate about this record, in the realms of like 21 Pilots' musical artistry, is how they sort of blur in some of those components of Scaled and Icy that I think were sort of clumsily handled on there a bit more gracefully, like on Midwest Indigo. I also adore the more pop bass driven bangers like Next Semester and Navigating better than anything on Scaled and Icy. There's just components of this that I think just sonically, you know, lyrically set it above that tenfold. And I think that, like, as far as showcasing their talents in a world building sense like Trench, without necessarily wholly leaning into the more pop-driven side that like a record like Blurry Face very much tapped into. I think that this sort of meets a lot of those worlds in the middle and creates a project that I think is pretty solid. I think that as far as like having some moments that I don't enjoy, it's still got some that creep up throughout the track listing. I really don't enjoy Routines in the Night all that much. I think that some of the writing on Lavish is weird in a way that I don't think works all that well. And even if I enjoy some of the intimacy on a track like The Craving, I don't think that Oldie Station comes together quite as strongly. I also don't like At the Risk of Feeling Dumb. I think that the instrumental out of that song just isn't it to me, Chief. But again, even if I think that especially the back end has some moments that stick out in a negative sense, the album closes really strongly. I like Paladin Straight. I think it's a pretty good song that, again, sort of sends the record off into the end of this AB conversation pretty choicely, in my opinion. By the by, I think that Clancy definitely nets more positive, in my opinion, than some other components of the 21 Pilots discography. I'd give this a 6. This is really solid. It's got moments that I enjoy a decent amount. Some of the hook stuff, like, again, Overcompensate's got like a simple but effective hook that I think the group does to kick things off really strongly, and blurs a lot of their components together into this pretty alright record at the end of the day. While I would say I'd champion a chunk of Bring Me the Horizon's discography, a decent amount, and I do get nostalgia for some of their records and respin them from time to time, I'm coming into the post-human era of their career with this project. I haven't spun a record of theirs or a release of theirs since Amo. I didn't hate Amo, but it was not my favorite thing the band had done, and I didn't really dig some of the pivots that record had seen them tackle. And it's not to say that, like, I haven't paid attention to what they've been dropping, because I see that they've been, like, relatively prolific since Amo, and I have, like, morbid curiosity on their discography since I've last left it. But with Next Gen, the second piece of the post-human saga, I kind of like what the band's pulling together. In some degrees, I feel like it's sort of, like, growing from even some of the points that I wasn't too keen on Amo, I think shine better on here. I think that, like, their blending of that with their more intense tendencies, I think, comes together a little more harmoniously. And I think that there's some genuine bangers in the mix here. You know, I enjoy the various genre pivots this face to sort of compare it to another record I've talked about this month. I admire what they're doing in the same way that I like what 21 Pilots is doing on Clancy, but I think that because maybe they've just got more longevity as artists, they bring together some of those scattered ideas a little more under this umbrella cleanly, in my opinion. You know, I enjoy the almost very 2000s anthemic rock that's seen on tracks like Utopia and N.A. I think that pocket of the record of N.A. through Rest in Peace Dustcore Remix is honestly, like, the best representation of what the record really has going on at its core. These very big-sounding rock and rock-adjacent tunes with these more electronic-driven tracks also woven throughout the mix. I actually like the evolution across Rip. I think that, like, the melding of electro-inspired sound with their brand of intensity, I think, comes together really well in the same way that I liked components of, like, There Is a Hell. I think it's really interesting that they came together with Aurora on Limousine. I think that that's another good sort of bridging of ideas that happens on here with their sound and other ideas they want to experiment. I think that a lot of the ideas, by and large, hit pretty strongly. I think that Kool-Aid and Top 10 Statues That Cried Blood are easy standouts for me. Kool-Aid is sort of the archetype of what I did with my alternate take of, as far as, like, breaching that Enter Shikari core. They do so much more gracefully on that. And Top 10 Statues That Cried Blood is just awesome as fuck. Honestly, the one collaboration that I would say surprised me more so, especially given that it's later in the track listing, so as the track got closer, I got more and more curious as to how it would sound. But amen. If only because Daryl from Glassjaw with Uzi Vert just is a combination that is something I never thought I'd see together. But I honestly kind of like Amen. I think it's heavy as fuck and it rips. Sure, I like some songs more than others, but I think that by and large, this is a decent step above where I would say I left them in a way that makes me very curious as to the road to this point personally. I'm giving this a 7. I really enjoyed this. I think that the production helped blend those ideas really strongly as well. I think some of the hooks are pretty strong. It's just really nice to see them nurture some of the ideas that they really believed in and pivot them in a way that I think suited them wonderfully. You know, between Free Sweatpants and the Ox with garbology sandwiched between, I would say Blockhead's been on a pretty good hot streak. And with Luminous Rubble, his most recent outing, he is stepping back into a strictly instrumental scope with a series of instrumentals that showcase his love of weaving horn samples amidst these hazy and somewhat eerie foreboding beats on an experience that I think more embellishes my love of his palette that he used on a record like Float. I think that as far as keeping the mood consistent across the runtime, I think he executes that pretty solidly on this project. Clocking in at just a little over 30 minutes, none of the songs really sit in their own proverbial pockets for too long before weaving into the next idea, but I think that a lot of the atmospheres here are still dripping with a lot of the style that I do enjoy from him. Take, for example, the horn loop on Scumlord, or the eerie synths that creep in on Dork Crystal that give way to this sort of stumbling bass line that carries the groove. You know, stuff like the twinkling pianos above the organ on Move Witch, or the strings that come in on Homeward Drowned Out, elevate some of these soundscapes into a little more of an elegant scope. Twinkling arpeggios add to the energy on Zoomies, you know, while on the other hand, the, you know, more mellow riff that carries out throughout Chill Pill helps send their own proverbial tracks over the edge, and in the latter's case, send the album around the bend in a pretty smooth fashion. I don't really have a whole lot negative to say about this, but I feel like as far as a record that has good atmosphere, almost wishing there was a little more to it, this is a project like that. You know, I think that these mixes are nice, but they don't feel full in a way that I would hope they would with the lack of like a vocal driving point to it. You know, I think that the hooks on here are pretty solid, and as far as like beats and like a beat tape style, this isn't bad. I'd probably give it a 7, if only for like, again, almost craving something a little more added to some of these songs to give them a little more of a unity, or like a moment that kind of like ties some of these tracks together. It feels like some of them are just missing a little spice to send them over the edge. But the atmosphere is consistent. Blockhead just never really disappoints as a beat maker when it comes to beats. By the by.
Try and drop the fee on a yacht, not drive a Fiat watch. How you gonna stop us with your measly asses? How? We don't stop.
Your old Droog has been hyping up and building a lot of hype for this movie album online, and I've been loving a lot of what he's been dropping to tease this project. I thought that DBZ was a strong-ass tune with him, Method Man, and Denzel coming with some real heat. I thought that he extended that heat even hotter on the Conductor collaboration Mercury Thermometers. And I think that on the actual album movie, he does keep that heat palpable by the by, and he seems to be going at a handful of people, like on Crescent Moon, where he just chops it up over this sort of eerie instrumental, carrying that into a little more of a confrontational, how do you do it? Turning that even deeper on a track like What Else? Or, you know, going at the industry as a whole on a track like 3 Milli, where he's talking about keeping it independent until the absolute right deal comes along. You know, matching that movie size scale to a T, while flipping that into this more interview style, you know, press tour sort of side of the coin, with some of the interview skits that come up on here and sort of talk about his reflection to where he's at. They help add to the gravitas that he's sort of spinning with, while giving it a little more of an intimate feel that he sort of uses to get personal in some more detailed fashions, like on Grandmother's Lessons or on The Sandbox, where he gets really reflective on himself. And I like how he bridges both of those worlds on here while not losing sight of a really strong core. I like this project a hell of a lot. I think that as far as like elevating his album construction and creating a good through line, I think that this does so really well. I think that the instrumental palette on here is that kind of boom bap worship that works for Droog's style of bar spinning, but again, it fits that scale that he's trying to play with and spit with across the board. While it's light on the collaborations outside of the ones that I talked about, I think that him and Yazine Bey closing it out on Care Plan is just a really good moment. I also love that while there's a core part of this where, especially in the interview portions, they talk about his past and his collaborations and stuff, he does use this record as another moment to just be like, hey man, I really am that dude. Because the bar spinning on here is pretty fucking strong. While I thought his bars on that Makami record were something else, that energy is not on any of Movie. I think that this record is fucking awesome. Another really strong hip-hop record in a year where the genre just keeps dropping gem after gem after gem. I'm gonna be giving this a 9. I really enjoy this project. I didn't think I'd be giving it this score, but like the more that I re-spin it, the more I think that like he does a lot of different facets in his lane just so strongly. I know I talked a lot about his bar spinning and the instrumental palette fitting his boom bap style, but even some of the hook stuff, like the hooks aren't, you know, aplenty, but even a track like I Think I Love Her, it's just really simple and direct, but well put together. I think that this is some really good stuff, and I think that it is another, just again, gem in his catalog that is stacked with some pretty decent material, in my opinion. You know, the thinning out of Remo Drive has been an interesting event to watch unfold, and on their newest album, Mercy, the now two-piece finds themselves creating this record that I think might be one of the more homogeneously dull pivots I've seen a band make, who was already on this relatively tepid trajectory over their last couple of records. I think that Mercy might be the point that I might give myself Mercy and sort of put this band in the rear view for myself. You know, while I think that a lot of the soundscape of this is fine, you know, the artistry is, like, decent enough. I think that, like, the sweet sounds on tracks like Please Please Be Smart, or, you know, the blending of fuzz and shimmery sounds on like Making Music evoke that kind of like springtime energy that I think the group can use pretty well, and I think do competently on those tracks and a couple others on here. I think By the By, a lot of this record kind of feels samey, and there's some moments in like chord progressions that like sort of feel like the band is sort of spinning in musical circles in a sort of sense. I swear to God, the groove and the climax on a track like All You'll Ever Catch crops up like 4 other times by this brief album's end. And if I'm gonna actually look at the lyrics for a second, a track like White Dress is like the worst kind of walking red flag. To try and backpedal your way out of not proposing to a long-term girlfriend, that's the kind of shit that, like, gives me the ick, personally. I don't like a lot of the energy that this record's carrying as a whole. You know, the toxic tendencies within the lyrics sort of get brought to the surface on a track like Houseplant, but I don't think that that makes any of the weird shit that crops up on here all that worth it. I'm giving this a 4, if only because, like, again, sonically, it's competent enough, but I don't like a lot of what everything else is going on with this project. And again, even if I like the way that it sounds, a lot of it sounds very similar and sort of homogenized by the runtime's brief end. I posted online a couple times that I was spinning this soundtrack, and I never even promoted that I would talk about it on the listening log, and I don't even know why. I love Disasterpeace. I've talked about Rich Vreeland's music a handful of times on here, And this ambient project is kind of an interesting experiment in his catalog. It is him adapting pieces he did for a different soundtrack. You know, I was reading the explanation for what this record is, and it's like, in the game, if you, like, hung out in different areas at different times, the music would get different, like, sounds to it, or, like, it would sound different, it would have different timbres, and this was, like, inspired by that. And it creates an interesting kind of experience, in my opinion. There's a lot of air in the production of this, you know, there's flat out some tracks that kind of incorporate different environmental sounds in the mix, like the rain that kind of creeps up on Frog Bit, which I would argue is a highlight to me personally. There's a wistfulness in the way that the pads on a track like Foxtail sort of sprinkle around each other. It evokes similarly some of the energy I felt when spinning the Fez soundtrack, but in a much more subdued sense. There's a lot more ambience in the ambience here, and it's not quite as like hook propelled as like that record was. And that's not to say that it's to the record's discredit if I'm comparing the two. Obviously, I do like Fez a hell of a lot more, but I think that as far as like creating an interesting, very airy ambient experience, Standstill is pretty fucking good in my opinion. You know, it's not without its dynamics on top of some of the other things I described. You know, there's like a low rumble that sort of stays beneath Tear Thumb that I think creates a whole different style all its own. I think that this is a really choice ambient album from an artist that I really love as a composer. You know, each track themselves is a day broken up into 3 parts, which I think creates its own dynamics from track to track that I think is kind of cool. With in regards to the record itself, I'm going to be giving it an 8 out of 10. You know, I think that it is a really interesting experience that I think, again, from track to track creates an interesting sort of flow across it, given how each song is constructed. But when stacking it against the rest of Rich's discography, it's still really good, but it's not as good as some of the places I've seen the man reach in his past. While I may not have talked about or, you know, gave Heaven and Earth the time of day when it released, I do like Kamasi Washington's brand of album conceptualization. I love the epic. I think it's aptly named. I think it's bold. I think it's well executed. It is a very good, dense jazz album, but that's something I could talk about another day. Fearless Movement, I think, does a good job at representing a lot of what I appreciate on what he does in a bold sense on the epic, and finds a way to, like, rein a lot of that in, still find a way to have these good sort of sonic through lines and these good sort of, like, recurring moods that crop up throughout it that I think create a well-constructed jazz record. I think stuff like the refrains on the opener, Lianu, along with the solo work on there, is crisp as hell. I love the way that that leads into the more catchy Asha the First that I think has this more funkier edge that I think helps sort of rein the record into a direction that I think it carries pretty smoothly. You know, I enjoy the way that that sort of gets toned down and grounded in Computer Love. I love how across the stretch after that he finds a way to sort of like twist it towards a realm that I feel like is more what I know from him, at least, as far as like the spaciousness. You know, the interlude with Terrence Martin, the Visionary, has a fun sort of like dreamlike whirlwind that I think leads into George Clinton just having some fun on Get Lit. I think that's another really good hook-driven song that sort of like keeps the listener engaged. But I love how after that he just goes further off the deep end with like the great trading with Andre 3000 on their respective instruments. I think that their, you know, leads do a good job at carrying the groove of that song. Which, speaking of solos, I think that the drum solo on Road to Self is fucking awesome. I love that it just goes the distance on top of that, and I think that it helps sort of carry that song as it goes the distance as well. And I like how even on the back end he finds a way to like bring it more into, even further into some of that sort of like spatial love I liked about the epic with Interstellarpeace. I love the chord progressions on there. I love the mood. I love the ambience. I love the orchestration on there as a whole. I think that it's a great song. I don't know. There's a lot of this record that I think is choice, and I think that if you like just nice balances of like jazz and funk, there's some cool stuff on here. I like Kamasi's style of album orchestration, and I think he made another really good record with the collaborators at hand on here, and I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. I think that it's pretty fucking strong. Now, while I put Kamasi off for 1 month, I've been pushing back Dostrotime since March, and for really no reason. But hey, I'm going to talk about it now, because I think Squarepusher, while I'm not, like, deep into his discography, even at this point, because I had talked about his last album on the listening log, and I thought it was fine. I thought it was pretty solid. But I think that this new album, I think, does a better job at showcasing his style of artistry a bit more extravagantly. I think that the melding of, like, these acoustic interludes in the Arcteon interludes, I think is a bold choice, especially considering, like, what I know him for. But I think he does a good job at sort of melding those ideas together, especially between the stretch between the second interlude and the end. Like, the back half of the record does a good job at, like, melding his style of, like, breakcore and electronic, like, propulsive-based music with guitars and bass, and creating this sort of like melding of like it and jazz in a sort of sense. It gives it like a very jazz feel that I really enjoy. I really appreciate. You know, I especially love the bass play on a track like Stromcore. I love the more electronic driven first half as well, but to like complement the sort of melding of stuff, there's a lot of cool stuff. Like, I love Dome Lash for sort of keeping those breakcore ass ideas at the forefront. You know, because tracks like Wind Alone and Crone Mech very much keep it synth as fuck, with like ambient pads and just these jittery electronics cropping through to create this sort of erratic experience out the gate. You know, Dune Ray is a fucking 2002 as fuck electronic song, and I absolutely love it. That's the type of shit I would make a bumper out of real quick. I just also really appreciate the ambient stuff that helps blend those acoustic soft ideas, like on Holer Form, along with the melding of like electric guitars and stuff. Kind of along the lines of what Venetian Stairs was doing back in 2019, but in a completely different sense that I also really appreciate. I don't know, this thing rips. Listen to it, please. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. I think that it's on the cusp of being a 9. The more that it's out, we'll see. But I think this record rips. I think that I've sat on it for too long, and you need to hear it if you like really cool electronic album ideas, concepts, and then this has some cool stuff in the pot that I think creates this very emotional core that makes it feel very different for an electronic experience that I appreciate. And that's what I spun this past month. Have you heard any of these records? What do you think about them? Let me know your thoughts on them and any records I should check out from this year in the comments down below. If you liked it, if you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week depending on what I've got going on. Thank you so very much for watching. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lots of situations, and I'll see you another day.